Some mistakes don't just ruin a day, they end a career. Danielle Callaway had spent years working her way up in the airline industry, priding herself on efficiency and control. She had been scolded before for allowing unqualified passengers to slip into first class, and she wasn't about to make that mistake again. Today, she would enforce the rules with absolute authority. So when she saw an elderly black woman settling into seat 1B, something inside her told her this was wrong. Maybe it was the way the woman carried herself. Calm, assured, not like the usual high-paying travelers Danielle was used to. Or maybe it was an unconscious prejudice, a whisper of doubt she didn't even question. Either way, she was certain this woman didn't belong here. Eloise Gardner had seen this before. The subtle skepticism, the extra questions, the quiet assumption that she was in the wrong place. She had learned to let it go many times before, to save herself the exhaustion. But today, as Danielle stood over her, demanding to see her ticket for the second time, something in Eloise hardened. She wasn't just tired of this, she was done with it. With a patient but knowing smile, she met Danielle's gaze and said, "You might want to check with your captain before you go any further." Danielle's irritation flared. Without hesitation, she snatched Eloise's ticket and turned toward the crew station, preparing to call for security. But just as she reached for the intercom, a voice crackled in her earpiece. Calm, but unmistakably authoritative. "Miss Callaway, please confirm the name of the passenger in question." Danielle's fingers hovered over the button. Something about the way the voice spoke sent a prickle down her spine. Eloise Gardner, sir." Silence. Then, the voice returned, quieter this time, dangerously so. "Would you like to repeat that?" Danielle's stomach dropped. The name, Gardner. She had heard it before, not just on a passenger list, not just in passing. It was a name that carried weight in this airline, a name that every employee was expected to recognize. And then it hit her, not just Mrs. Gardner, Ba Gardner, the wife of the man who owned the airline. The realization landed like a punch to the gut. Her grip on the intercom slackened. A few passengers had started to murmur, and across the aisle, she saw Emily, the younger flight attendant, staring at her with wide eyes, whispering to a colleague. A man in business attire leaned slightly toward her row and muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Danielle to hear. "Oh no, she's done." Danielle swallowed, her throat dry. The entire plane had gone still, waiting to see what would happen next. But Danielle already knew. There was no fixing this. No apology would be enough. And worst of all, there was no one to blame but herself. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Passengers hurried through security, last-minute announcements echoed overhead, and the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases filled the air. Amid the rush, one woman moved differently. Eloise Gardner, a dignified black woman in her 70s, walked through the terminal with an air of quiet confidence. Unlike the flustered travelers around her, she was in no hurry. She had flown too many times, seen too much of the world, to let the frantic energy of the airport unsettle her. Dressed in a neatly pressed navy dress with a soft blue shawl draped over her shoulders, she exuded elegance without effort. In her hands, she carried a small leather purse and a modest carry-on. Nothing excessive, nothing flashy. As she approached the first-class boarding lane, a young gate agent greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Gardner. Have a wonderful flight." Eloise returned a polite nod, appreciating his professionalism. She had long learned that kindness in these moments was unpredictable. Sometimes it was freely given, and other times it came reluctantly, only after proving she belonged. Today, at least at the gate, there was no hesitation. The cabin smelled of polished leather and the faint aroma of expensive cologne. The overhead lights cast a warm glow over the plush first-class seats, already occupied by a few passengers sipping pre-flight champagne or adjusting their reclining positions. The flight attendants moved with rehearsed efficiency, ensuring everything was in place before departure. Eloise reached seat 1B, carefully placing her bag near her feet. She sighed softly, settling in, reaching for the book tucked inside her purse. But before she could turn a single page, a voice sliced through the calm. "Excuse me, ma'am." The tone wasn't welcoming. It wasn't the polite professionalism she was used to from airline staff. It was sharp, skeptical. Looking up, Eloise met the gaze of Danielle Callaway. Danielle Callaway had spent over a decade in the airline industry. She wasn't just any flight attendant. She was a senior member of the crew, someone who had worked hard to earn her authority. She prided herself on maintaining order, ensuring everything ran as it should. But she had also learned, consciously or not, to judge people at a glance. She had made mistakes before, allowing passengers to slip into the wrong seats, failing to question those who didn't fit the usual first-class profile. And after a particularly scathing reprimand from her supervisor last month about letting standards slip, she had sworn she wouldn't make that mistake again. Today, she saw Eloise Gardner sitting in seat 1B, and something in her gut told her it was a mistake. She didn't see the graceful confidence in the older woman's posture. She didn't notice the refined way she carried herself. She only saw what she wasn't expecting, a black woman traveling alone in a first-class seat. And in that moment, Danielle made an assumption. Not far away, Emily Reed, a younger flight attendant, observed the scene from the galley. Emily had been in this job long enough to recognize tension before it escalated. She saw the way Danielle squared her shoulders, the way her expression tightened just slightly, signs that she had already made up her mind about Eloise before even speaking to her. Emily wanted to step in, to say something before things went too far. But Danielle was senior staff, and questioning her directly could cause problems for Emily. So, for now, she simply watched, hoping the situation would resolve itself. She had no idea how wrong she was. Danielle folded her arms, standing rigid over Eloise. "This is first class," she stated, as if explaining something complex to a confused passenger. Eloise arched an eyebrow, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm aware." Danielle hesitated for a fraction of a second before extending a hand. "May I see your ticket?" There was no need. The gate agent had already checked it. Eloise had already taken her seat, but she recognized the request for what it was, not a procedure, but a challenge. She didn't argue. Instead, she retrieved her boarding pass from her purse and handed it over. Danielle's eyes flicked over the ticket. The name matched the seat. Everything was correct. Yet, even as she handed it back, a flicker of doubt remained in her expression. "Just making sure," she muttered. Eloise accepted the ticket with a knowing smile, saying nothing. She had lived too many years, experienced too much of the world, to be rattled by this. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned whether she belonged. But today, for once, she wasn't going to let it slide. Danielle clenched her jaw as she walked back toward the galley, gripping the passenger manifest a little too tightly. Something about that woman, Eloise Gardner, unnerved her. The quiet way she had held her ground. The unspoken challenge in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Passengers who didn't belong in first class usually backed down quickly. They shuffled awkwardly to economy, muttering apologies. But Eloise hadn't even raised her voice. She had simply waited, letting Danielle make the first move. And somehow, that had made Danielle feel like she was the one who had to prove something. She glanced around the cabin. Passengers were pretending not to listen, but she could feel their eyes on her. She needed to reassert control before this spiraled further. Danielle turned back toward Eloise, smoothing down her uniform as she approached seat 1B once again. "Mrs. Gardner," she said, forcing a tight smile. "I'm sorry, but I need you to move." Eloise didn't look up from her book. She turned a page deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. "Move?" she asked without looking at Danielle. Danielle's patience was thinning. "Yes," she said, folding her arms. "There's been a mix-up. This seat isn't available for you." Now Eloise looked up. She tilted her head slightly, considering the woman standing before her. "My ticket says 1B. Danielle let out a slow breath, as if explaining something difficult. "I know, but..." She hesitated. What excuse could she use? There was no mix-up. The seat was assigned correctly. But backing down now would mean admitting she had been wrong. "This seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger," she finally said. The words hung in the air. Eloise's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. She closed her book with a soft thud and placed it carefully on the armrest. "And what kind of passenger am I?" she asked, her voice steady. Danielle faltered. For the first time, she saw the trap she had walked into. She had no real justification for what she was doing. A few passengers shifted in their seats, some exchanging looks. A man across the aisle cleared his throat as if about to say something, but quickly looked away. Danielle's fingers curled at her sides. "I just meant, if there's a real issue with my seat," Eloise interrupted. "I'd like to hear it from the captain." Danielle's jaw tightened. The last thing she wanted was for the captain to get involved. But before she could respond, another voice entered the conversation. Emily had been watching the entire exchange from the galley, her stomach twisting with unease. She knew Danielle was in the wrong. This was about more than a simple seating issue. It was personal. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Danielle turned sharply, caught off guard by the interruption. "No problem at all," she snapped. Emily's gaze flickered to Eloise, then back to Danielle. "Then why are we asking a seated first-class passenger to move?" Danielle hesitated. She hadn't expected to be questioned in front of passengers. She had counted on everyone ignoring the situation like they usually did. But now, with Emily stepping in, there was no graceful way out. She needed Eloise to back down. "I'm not moving," Eloise said simply. Danielle's face darkened. "Fine," she said through clenched teeth. "If you won't listen, I'll call security." Eloise remained seated, calm as ever. Danielle, however, felt the heat rising in her chest. She had been challenged, undermined in front of passengers, and now she was losing control of the situation. Without thinking, she reached forward and grabbed Eloise's arm. "Listen, lady." The slap came fast and sharp. Not from Eloise, but from Danielle. A sharp gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Several passengers turned, frozen in their seats. Danielle's own breath caught in her throat. She hadn't meant to do it. Not like this, not in front of so many people. Eloise had turned slightly from the force of the slap, but when she looked back at Danielle, her expression wasn't one of anger. It was disappointment. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Emily's face went pale. "Did you just?" she whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Danielle's hand was still raised, as if even her own body hadn't caught up to what she had done. And then, Eloise moved. Not to retaliate, not to shout. She simply reached down, picked up her phone, and typed a single message. Then, with quiet dignity, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Danielle had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Danielle's breath came fast, her chest rising and falling as she stared at Eloise. She hadn't meant for it to happen, at least, not like this. She had only wanted to put the woman in her place, to make it clear who was in control. But now, as the hush in the first-class cabin stretched on, she realized something terrible. She had lost control. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were whispering. Others had their phones in hand, though it wasn't clear if they were recording or just pretending to be busy. Emily, still frozen beside them, found her voice. "Danielle," she started, barely above a whisper. "You just hit a passenger." Danielle turned sharply toward her. "Stay out of this, Emily," she snapped, her voice shaking. But Emily wasn't the one she needed to worry about. Across from them, a businessman cleared his throat, as if about to speak. But when Danielle's eyes flickered toward him, he quickly looked away. No one wanted to get involved. That was always how these situations played out. People preferred silence over discomfort. Except for one person. Eloise still hadn't moved. She didn't rub her cheek. She didn't demand an apology. She simply placed her phone down on the armrest, screen facing up. A single message had been sent. Danielle swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. Who had she just texted? Danielle took a step back, smoothing her uniform as if fixing her appearance would erase what had just happened. "Fine," she said stiffly. "If you won't listen, I'll call security." She turned on her heel, marching toward the front of the plane. Emily remained frozen, torn between following Danielle and staying with Eloise. Leaning in slightly, she whispered, "Are you okay?" Eloise gave a small nod. "I'm fine." Emily hesitated. Should I get someone?" Eloise glanced down at her phone and smiled faintly. "I already have." Emily blinked, confused. "Who?" Eloise didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her purse and placed it neatly on her lap. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Danielle reached the intercom near the cockpit. She pressed the button, her voice tight with forced professionalism. "Captain, we have an issue in first class. A passenger is refusing to move from a seat that isn't hers. I need ground security to remove her before takeoff." A pause. Then the captain's voice crackled through the speaker. Name of the passenger? Danielle exhaled, frustrated. Eloise Gardner. Silence. Danielle frowned. Captain. Then, the intercom crackled again. But this time, the voice that responded wasn't the captain's. It was deeper, calmer, and far more dangerous. This is Charles Gardner. Would you like to repeat what you just said? Danielle's stomach dropped. Her fingers hovered over the intercom button, but she couldn't press it, couldn't move. Emily, still crouched beside Eloise, let out a small breath as realization hit her. Oh no, she whispered. Danielle swallowed hard. Charles Gardner. She repeated the name in her head as if saying it to herself would change something. And then, through the intercom, his voice came again, sharp, unshaken. Yes, my wife, Eloise Gardner. The woman you just put your hands on. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen snapped their heads up. A wave of tension rolled through the cabin, heavier than before. Danielle felt the blood drain from her face. She had no idea what she had just done. Danielle's hands trembled slightly as she stepped back from the intercom. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had worked for this airline for years. She knew the names of the most powerful figures behind the company. And Charles Gardner. He wasn't just a shareholder. He wasn't just an executive. He was the majority owner of the airline. The man who built this company from the ground up. The man who could end careers with a single phone call. Danielle had just slapped his wife. Passengers in first class were no longer pretending to be uninterested. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared openly, waiting for what would happen next. The intercom crackled again. Charles's voice was even calmer. Colder. Miss Callaway, I asked you a question. Would you like to repeat what you just said? Danielle's lips parted, but no words came out. Emily, still kneeling beside Eloise, felt the weight of the moment before speaking softly. Mrs. Gardner, do you want me to get the captain? Eloise gave a small shake of her head. No need. She picked up her phone again, typing a brief message. She set it down gently on the armrest before folding her hands in her lap, looking as composed as ever. She was waiting. Danielle's fingers twitched. She needed to fix this. Fast. She cleared her throat and pressed the intercom button again, forcing her voice into a professional tone. There's been a misunderstanding, she said quickly. Mrs. Gardner's seat assignment must have been processed incorrectly, and I was just trying to clarify. Charles cut her off. So you put your hands on her? Danielle closed her eyes for half a second, her pulse spiking. Aye. The intercom clicked off. Silence. Then, the cockpit door swung open. Captain Jonathan Pierce stepped out. A man in his late 50s, streaks of gray at his temples, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his cap slightly before speaking. His voice was firm, commanding. Miss Callaway. Danielle stiffened. Captain, He didn't let her finish. That wasn't a request. The first-class cabin fell into a heavy silence. Emily rose to her feet, stepping slightly away as Danielle slowly turned and walked toward the cockpit. The door clicked shut behind them. Danielle stood stiffly, hands clasped tightly in front of her, her breathing shallow. The flight supervisor, Richard Hale, appeared on the cockpit's communication screen. His expression was just as serious. He had clearly been called into this situation, and that was never a good sign. Danielle licked her lips, forcing herself to keep her composure. Captain, Pierce held up a hand. Be quiet. Her mouth snapped shut. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple before speaking. Do you have any idea what you just did? Danielle's pulse spiked. Of course she knew, but she couldn't afford to admit it. Captain, I was just trying to follow protocol. I thought the woman was in the wrong seat. Richard's voice cut through the static of the communication screen. You slapped the wife of the owner of this airline. Danielle winced. Hearing it out loud made it even worse. Pierce leaned forward, his gaze sharp. What gave you the authority to put your hands on a passenger? Danielle swallowed hard. I lost my temper. Richard and Pierce exchanged a dangerous look. Then, Pierce leaned back in his seat. Orders from Mr. Gardner himself. He locked eyes with Danielle. You are immediately relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Danielle sat frozen in the cockpit, her mind spinning. This can't be happening. But it was happening. Captain Pierce's voice echoed in her ears. You are immediately relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Danielle's throat went dry. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could get a word out, Richard Hale, the flight supervisor, continued in a flat, emotionless tone. When we land, you will not report to crew debriefing. Instead, you will be escorted directly to the airline's administrative office, where a formal review will take place. Danielle's chest tightened. A formal review? That wasn't just a slap on the wrist. That was corporate talk for termination. Her hands clenched into fists. She had spent years building her career, rising through the ranks, gaining authority. And now, because of one mistake, one moment of losing her temper, it was all slipping through her fingers. She refused to let that happen. She had to fix this. Pierce nodded toward the door. Now, you will walk back to first class, retrieve your belongings, and take a crew jump seat in the back of the plane. You will not interact with passengers for the remainder of this flight. Danielle's face burned with humiliation. She had never been ordered to sit in the crew section like a rookie on her first day. She tried again. "Captain, please, if I can just..." Pierce cut her off. "If you refuse, I will have the air marshal on board remove you from duty right now." Danielle stiffened. The air marshal? Her stomach twisted violently. She had no way out. With a long, shaky breath, she forced a nod. Her hands trembled as she stood up, her legs weak beneath her. Without another word, she turned and stepped out of the cockpit. The moment she entered first class, she felt every eye on her. Passengers who had once ignored her were now openly watching. Some with curiosity, others with quiet satisfaction. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She was the spectacle. A low murmur spread through the cabin as she retrieved her bag. "That's her. The one who hit the lady. Did you see the captain's face? She's done. I heard she's being removed from duty." Danielle bit her lip hard. She kept her head down, forcing herself not to react. As she turned to leave, a voice stopped her cold. "Miss Callaway." She already knew who had spoken. Her stomach twisted painfully. Slowly, she turned. Eloise Gardner sat exactly where she had been the entire flight. Calm, composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't demanded anything. Yet somehow, she was in complete control. Danielle forced a tight smile. "Yes, Mrs. Gardner." Eloise studied her for a long moment. Then, in the calmest, most deliberate voice, she asked, "Do you still believe I don't belong in this seat?" The words hit like a slap to the face. Danielle opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Passengers nearby had fallen silent, waiting for her response. Eloise's gaze was steady, patient. "I'd like an answer." Danielle's body tensed. She knew what the right answer was. She knew she should apologize, bow her head, beg for forgiveness. But her pride, her damn pride, wouldn't let her. She swallowed hard. I made a mistake." Eloise nodded slightly, as if expecting the weak response. Then she said, "I hope it's one you don't make again." Passengers reacted immediately. Some looked satisfied. Others shook their heads. A few even whispered. That was deserved. Danielle's humiliation was complete. She turned sharply and walked away, each step heavier than the last. She had never felt smaller. Danielle reached the back of the plane, sliding into the cramped crew jump seat. Her uniform suddenly felt suffocating. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. She couldn't stop thinking about what was waiting for her on the ground. Emily appeared near the galley, hovering uncertainly. After a long pause, she spoke. "Are you okay?" Danielle let out a bitter laugh. "No." Emily sighed. "I didn't think so." Danielle rubbed her face, her hands shaking slightly. "Maybe I can still talk to him. Maybe if I explain." Emily cut her off. "Explain what? That it was a misunderstanding? That you were following protocol?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because that's not going to work. And you know it." Danielle swallowed. Her throat was dry. Emily leaned against the counter. "Do you really not get why this is happening?" Danielle frowned. "Of course I get it." Emily shook her head. "I don't think you do." She crossed her arms. "You didn't just mix up a seat, Danielle. You looked at her and decided on the spot that she didn't belong in first class." Danielle flinched. "That's not." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it?" Danielle couldn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. Emily sighed. "I don't think you meant for it to go this far. But the fact that it did, that means you need to take responsibility for it." Danielle let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Even if I do, it won't matter. I'm already done, aren't I?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The plane gave a soft jolt as the landing gear deployed. Then, the final announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened." Danielle sat completely still. This was it. She had spent years in this industry, thinking she was untouchable. She had been the one enforcing the rules, the one in control. But today, she was the one being removed. The plane touched down with a soft thud. A few passengers clapped, an old habit. For Danielle, the sound felt mocking. She barely noticed as the plane taxied to the gate. Then came the final ding, the seatbelt light shutting off. Emily gave her one last look. Passengers stood, gathering their belongings. Some moved quickly, eager to exit, but many lingered. Watching, Danielle could feel it. They were all waiting to see what was about to happen. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and forced herself to stand. She turned toward the open doorway and froze, because standing at the front of the jet bridge, visible through the open door, was a team of airline executives. And at the center of them was Charles Gardner. His face was unreadable. His posture was calm, controlled, but standing beside him were two uniformed security officers. Danielle's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a meeting. This wasn't just a disciplinary review. She was about to be escorted off the plane like a criminal. And in that moment, she realized. She wasn't afraid of losing her job. She was afraid of what Charles Gardner was planning next. Danielle stood frozen at the threshold of the jet bridge, her stomach twisting into knots. The sight of Charles Gardner, flanked by airline executives and uniformed security officers, was enough to confirm what she already knew deep down. There was no coming back from this. For years, she had been the one standing in control at the aircraft doors, watching passengers file in and out, deciding who was treated with kindness and who was dismissed without a second thought. But today, she was the one being removed. Passengers were whispering, their gazes flickering between her and the powerful man waiting at the exit. Emily hovered a few feet away, her face unreadable. She hadn't spoken since the plane landed. She didn't need to. Eloise Gardner remained seated, taking her time packing up her belongings, as if she had all the time in the world. She hadn't looked at Danielle again since their last exchange. But she didn't have to. Danielle could feel the weight of this moment, the finality of it, settling over her like a crushing weight. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and forced herself to step forward. Each step down the aisle felt like a public execution. Passengers didn't even try to pretend they weren't watching. Some had their phones out, their screens held at subtle angles, likely recording every humiliating moment. The whispers were louder now. She's done. She's being escorted off the plane. Didn't she hit someone? She hit the owner's wife. Danielle clenched her jaw and kept walking. She had no other choice. As soon as she stepped onto the jet bridge, the security officers subtly positioned themselves on either side of her, not grabbing her, but making it very clear she was not free to leave on her own. The air was thick with tension. Charles Gardner's expression was impossible to read. He didn't look angry. He didn't look pleased. He looked calm. And somehow, that was far more terrifying. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, measured, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. "Miss Callaway." Danielle straightened instinctively. "Mr. Gardner," she forced out. Charles studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I assume you know why I'm here." Danielle swallowed. She had to choose her words carefully. "I understand there was an issue," she said carefully, forcing a neutral tone. "And I deeply regret any misunderstanding with your wife." She barely got the words out before Charles lifted a hand. "Stop." Her voice died in her throat. He tilted his head slightly. "This isn't about misunderstandings." His gaze sharpened, cold and unwavering. "And I don't care about what you regret." The entire jet bridge fell silent. Danielle's pulse skyrocketed. The executives beside him stood still, their faces unreadable. The security officers shifted slightly, preparing for whatever came next. Danielle felt the floor beneath her slip. She opened her mouth, scrambling for something, anything, to say. But before she could, Charles turned to one of the senior executives beside him and spoke the words that shattered her last hope. "Effective immediately, Danielle Callaway is permanently dismissed from this airline." Danielle felt the words like a punch to the stomach. She gasped softly, barely processing it. "Wait." Charles lifted a hand again. "We're not done." Danielle's legs went weak. He turned back toward her, his voice quiet but razor sharp. "You are to be escorted directly from this flight. Your contract is terminated, and your employment record will reflect that you were dismissed for conduct violations. The whispers from the passengers behind her grew louder. Some openly reacted. Danielle's heart pounded violently. "Mr. Gardner, please," she choked out. For the first time, Charles's expression shifted. A flicker of amusement. Danielle froze. That was the look of a man who had heard this before. A man who had seen people beg to undo what they had done. His next words sealed her fate. "You want a second chance?" he asked, his voice almost amused. Danielle nodded quickly. I do." Charles studied her for a long moment. Then he chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You had a chance." His voice dropped to a lethal calm. "The moment you looked at my wife and assumed she didn't belong." Danielle stopped breathing. Charles stepped forward. Lowering his voice so only she could hear, he murmured, "You could have stopped at questioning her seat." He took another step closer. "You could have stopped at making her prove she had a first-class ticket." His eyes darkened. "But you didn't. You made a choice, Miss Callaway." Danielle's hands trembled. "You thought you had power over her." His voice turned to steel. "And now, you have none." Danielle choked on her words. She knew. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just about losing her job. Her career was over. Even if she tried to apply elsewhere, this would follow her. No airline, no respectable company in the industry would ever take a chance on someone who had been personally dismissed by Charles Gardner. Her breath came fast. Her head spun. This couldn't be real. But it was. Charles stepped back and gave a simple nod to the security officers. "Escort her out." The final walk. One of the officers gestured for her to move. Danielle didn't. She couldn't. But she had no choice. Passengers openly stared now. Some even lifted their phones, whispering among themselves. Danielle's face burned with humiliation. She had spent years commanding the rules of this plane. And now, she was being walked off like a problem that needed to be handled. Her feet felt heavy as she stepped toward the exit. The whispers grew louder. The stares were unbearable. And just as she passed Eloise Gardner's seat, a soft, patient voice broke through the noise. "I hope you remember this." Eloise's gaze never left the window. She didn't need to look at Danielle. Her words were enough. Danielle's stomach dropped. She forced herself to keep walking. Her hands clenched into fists. But as she stepped off the plane, feeling the weight of her entire career collapsing, she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this moment. Because Charles Gardner hadn't just fired her. He had erased her. Danielle stepped onto the jet bridge, her legs unsteady, her hands clammy. The air inside the enclosed tunnel felt thick, suffocating, but she couldn't stop moving. The two security officers flanked her on either side, not touching her, not forcing her, but making it clear that she was no longer in control. She was no longer a respected crew member. She was no longer the one with authority. She was a liability being removed. With each step, the reality sank in deeper. She had spent years commanding planes, enforcing rules, deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, she was just another person being escorted out of an airport. Her heart pounded as they reached the end of the jet bridge, where the airline's administrative team was already waiting. A woman in a Navy business suit, holding a tablet, barely glanced at her before speaking to one of the security officers. "She's coming with me." The woman's name tag read, Rebecca Lynn, Senior Flight Operations Manager. Danielle opened her mouth, trying to find something, anything, to say that would change what was happening. But Rebecca had already turned on her heel, expecting Danielle to follow. She had no choice. Danielle swallowed the lump of humiliation in her throat and did as she was told. The terminal was as busy as ever. Passengers milled about, some rushing to catch flights, others waiting at gates, completely unaware of the storm raging inside of her. But a few had been on the flight. A few had seen what happened, and they recognized her. She could feel their eyes on her. Some stared outright. Others whispered behind their hands. A few even lifted their phones, pretending to check notifications, but really snapping pictures. Danielle's stomach twisted violently. She had been the enforcer. She had been the authority. She had been the one who handled problem passengers. And now, she was the story. The viral news article waiting to happen. She kept her head down, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to disappear. But she couldn't. Rebecca led her into a private elevator, swiping her badge to access a restricted area of the airport. The doors slid shut, sealing them in a silent, tense space. Danielle forced herself to speak. "Miss Lynn," she started, keeping her voice even, professional, as if she still had a right to be part of a normal conversation. Rebecca didn't even look at her. She simply scrolled through a report on her tablet. Danielle hesitated, then pushed forward. "I understand that Mr. Gardner is upset, and I take full responsibility for what happened, but Rebecca let out a sharp exhale. Finally, she lifted her gaze. Her expression was cool, unreadable, and her words? They ended everything. "Miss Callaway," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't a disciplinary hearing." Danielle frowned. Rebecca's eyes hardened. "There is no performance review, no suspension, no formal process where you defend yourself." She tilted the tablet toward Danielle. And there it was. The official termination letter. Already drafted. Already signed. Effective immediately. Danielle's heart slammed against her ribs. She stared at the words. "No, there has to be." Rebecca didn't let her finish. "You are permanently banned from working for this airline, effective today." She swiped the screen, pulling up another document. "And per direct request from Mr. Gardner, a flag has been placed on your employment record." Danielle felt her stomach drop. "A flag?" Rebecca's voice remained cold. "You will not be hired at any airline affiliated with our parent company." She glanced back at her screen. That includes over 40 airlines worldwide. Danielle's vision blurred. This wasn't just losing her job. This was the end of her career. Rebecca remained unmoved. "You will be escorted to collect your personal items from the crew office." Her voice was calm, rehearsed. "After that, you will be taken directly to the airport exit, where you will return your uniform and badge." Danielle's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing she could say, nothing she could do. Rebecca pressed a button on her tablet, then looked back at Danielle. Her final instruction was simple. "You are never to board one of our planes again." The elevator dinged. The doors slid open, and waiting for her, 2 more security officers. Danielle took a slow, shaky step forward. As she stepped out, the weight of her mistakes crashed down on her all at once. She had never imagined her career would end like this. But as she walked down the hall, flanked by security, she realized something even worse than losing her job. She had always believed she was untouchable, that she could get away with anything as long as she had seniority, as long as she had authority. But now, she had nothing, because the power she thought she had was never really hers to begin with. Danielle stepped through the sliding glass doors of the airport. The rush of outside air hit her like a slap. For a brief moment, she just stood there, gripping the strap of her purse so tightly, her fingers went numb. She wasn't sure what to do. For years, she had always known her next step, her next flight, her next schedule, her next crew assignment. Her life had been structured, predictable, controlled. But now, there was nothing. She had savings. But for how long? She had experience. But who would hire her now? Passengers bustled past, moving in all directions, catching taxis, calling rides, greeting family. For them, it was just another day. For her, everything had changed. She turned, glancing over her shoulder at the airport. Her airport, the place where she had built her career, the place where she had ruled for years, the place that had just spit her out like she was nothing. And in that moment, she finally understood. She had believed she was powerful, that passengers were the ones who had no control, that they had to listen, to obey. But Eloise Gardner had done nothing. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't threatened. She had simply waited. And with a single text, she had unraveled everything. Danielle let out a breath, shaky and uneven. She didn't know where to go from here. She didn't even know who she was anymore. Because she was no longer Danielle Callaway, senior flight attendant. She was just Danielle. And for the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go. And that's how one moment of arrogance, one moment of unchecked power, brought everything crashing down for Danielle Callaway. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think the punishment was fair? Did she deserve to lose everything? Or should she have been given a second chance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps us bring more powerful stories to you. And if you don't want to miss our next story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.